The 3D gun movement, the 3D printed gun movement, I should say, is gaining strength. We saw the Liberator gun debuted just a couple of weeks ago, an entirely 3D printed, or I should say almost entirely 3D printed gun. You do need a metal firing pin, and the plans do include, for a larger piece of metal, that would stop this gun from going through metal detectors, but of course that piece can be taken out and the gun is still functional. Now, I'm not going to get into a discussion yet again about the ethics or morality of spreading these blueprints. I'm not going to talk about whether it's a good thing for the country in general that these gun blueprints are out there for good. But there's an interesting consequence of these 3D printed guns. Will 3D printed guns possibly take down the NRA? Now that seems like a bit of an overstatement at this point, since all we've seen so far is that single-shot Liberator pistol. But there's new information coming out that, lead to some silver lining, I suppose, in this issue. Now, the way that the NRA and the gun manufacturers have worked historically in America is that a lot of guns are sold every single year, and the gun manufacturers, Beretta, Benelli, Heckler & Koch, companies like that, have been major donors to the NRA. That's how they are able to lobby, to make donations to politicians on both sides of the aisle across the country. Now, with the spread, inevitably, eventually, of 3D gun printing, at some point, this is going to cut into the profits of those corporations. When Netflix became big, Blockbuster took it on the chin. You have to expect that the rise of pirated ebooks have something to do with the fact that these large bookstores have started to close down around the country. Now, I don't think that 3D printed guns are going to be as popular as pirated copies of the Game of Thrones, but at some point it should have an impact. And the reason for that is that while these 3D printed guns at this point are simply single-shot guns that can't really stand up to what you can find in any Walmart, in just a couple of weeks since the original Liberator was sold, there's now one called the Lulz Liberator that can hold 9 bullets and is slightly more resilient, less likely to break down after each firing. This is after just a couple of weeks. Now, once these 3D printed guns, the plans are crowdsourced across the country, and we have 6 months or a year of 2 years of development, is it really all that impossible to imagine that they'll come up with guns that can rival those put out every day by Beretta and Benelli? I think that it's entirely possible. I know that I personally am very interested in printing out replicas of, fantasy swords and warhammers and things like that. If you can make those, you can also make the guns. And so, at some point, as this eats into the profits of these large gun manufacturers, I expect that donations to the NRA will also go down. Now, that could very well be offset by donations by individuals. That is not impossible at this point. But because the NRA in the last few decades has relied so much on donations from these large manufacturers, it could very well have a long-term impact on the NRA. Now, it's impossible at this point to speculate out a decade, 2 decades into how much impact this will have on gun policies in America, but it's an interesting thing to, keep in mind. And I am sure that the man who invented the Liberator did not expect that at some point this might lead to a massive change in the power of the NRA.